Instagram. I'm waiting for Nhien to join. And I'm just going to do my usual being awkward while I wait. Let's see if we can find her. Sorry for the awkward silence. I know people hate that. Oh, here we go.
Hey, I'm just figuring this out. Is my head completely cut off? Oh, dang. All right, let me work on this here. Let's take a minute. I actually have the door open. Better. Is that better? Can you actually see me now? Yeah. Sorry, are you in a super uncomfortable position though? It's all right. Yeah. I always sit like cross-legged here as I work anyway, so here I am in my little cushion, etc. Yeah. Well, it's nicely framed. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, let's get started because Nhien is here. As you guys know, if you're here, it's Sexy First Friday for September, and this month our topic is on sex, spirituality, and the Enneagram. So Lindsay is out on vacation, and we wanted to invite a friend and colleague, Nhien Vuong, to be a guest. Nhien is a reverend and a spirituality guru, in my opinion. And since we're here to talk about spirituality, we thought she would be the perfect person to have on. So how we know each other, actually, how we know Nhien and Lindsay and myself, we're all part of an interdisciplinary group on the Enneagram and sexuality. So in that group, we have sexuality researchers like myself, we have a minister, we have therapists, sex therapists, and otherwise. And from all of those, we share our insights on the topic of sexuality and the Enneagram. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Sam E Greenberg. I'm a sexuality researcher and Enneagram and sexuality coach. And I've been studying sexuality and the Enneagram for many years at this point. I'm specifically focused on sexual desire. So Nhien, you tell us more about yourself and also tell us about your spiritual journey and spirituality. All right. Well, so great to be here. I am the founder of Evolving Enneagram, a licensed and ordained Unity minister. And but how it all started is, so I actually grew up in a family that was non-religious. But from a very early age, in elementary school, I was like asking questions about like the meaning of life and just very obsessed with this. And I really searched like from my early years reading books about spirituality, but I never actually landed on anything in particular until I'd say well after law school. So I became an attorney well after law school, where I hit a bottom in my life, and I actually started a 12-step program of recovery related to, get this, on topic, sexuality, relationships, intimacy. And that was actually the beginning of my spiritual awakening. So the topic of sexuality is really dear to my heart because it was like the opening for me to enter into like a spiritual journey. So
So yeah, like it was really a pretty devastating, like basically hitting bottom in my life. And then in the 12-step program, for those who aren't familiar, there's this idea around like surrendering over to a higher power. And I did not know what that was at the time. And so there was a long and ongoing journey of like establishing my relationship with this power greater than myself, if you will. And yeah, so that's kind of my opening, you know, that got me through a lot of different things like unity spirituality, which is sort of rooted in this notion of original blessing instead of original sin, which has been some of the most profound healing for me. This idea that like we're inherently whole as we are, irrespective of what we believe. Like that was the foundation for my journey, and it was foundation for not only my spiritual relationship, like and connection, but my healing in the area of sexuality. So yeah, that's just a little teaser. So yeah.
That's so wonderful that sexuality was actually the doorway to spirituality for you. And that's something we're going to talk about a bunch more. And you can talk more about your journey as we go on. Let's just let everyone know for fun our types and stackings, because I think there's something kind of cool about you and me, because we have the same stacking. Mm-hmm. So I'm a type 5 and a sexual dominant 5. My stacking is sexual, social, and then self-preservation, repressed.
Yes, and this actually does relate to my spiritual journey for sure, that I identify as a sexual 3. So the stacking is sexual, social, self-preservation, repressed. And so yeah, we very much connect on that on that as our default, you know, like, you know, not wanting to like reinforce it or anything, but just for sure. And I wanted to make a quick comment about that in relation to my sexual journey. I mean, this whole idea of addiction and understanding that in a way I had made somebody else, my partner usually, right? The guy that I was interested in, my higher power. And like where that became a substitute for a direct relationship with the divine, and understanding how now understanding that I'm a sexual type 3. Oh my God, talk about making sense. The way 3s already give away their power in that way to outer affirmation of identity and worth, and how the sexual instinct just exacerbated that in me. And so looking at type, spiritually, it's almost like looking at the ways that we make idols, like in front of our experience and our direct connection with like oneness or the universe or love itself. We're like, no, I'll have that instead. And that never feeds, right? Like it's like an endless way, like the way that Enneagram type is like addiction. So I just want to go back and bring that in and tie it into my own journey as well. Yeah.
So let's get into it more. So the goal today is we're going to get into talking about how sex, the Enneagram, and spirituality overlap. But I want to start with just the Enneagram and spirituality and how they overlap. A lot of people already understand that inherently, but Nhien, you work with the Enneagram primarily from a spiritual perspective. So what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so what that means for me, I mean, talking about that notion of original blessing, I believe that the Enneagram circle like really represents our wholeness, and that we are not our Enneagram types, but we come into this world and we develop this propensity to over-identify with one little dot on the Enneagram rather than like the whole of our being. And that little dot says, okay, if I'm a 3, I can only be this. I can only be successful. I can only like look good. I'm not allowed to look messy, or, like there are these ways in which claiming my wholeness and actually embracing my divine identity, if you will, are the same to me. And so there's something about learning that egoic fixation that is the Enneagram is not the whole of me, and that I can trust that the whole of me is good, and holy even, right? And embrace that. Like that's to me, so it's almost like the 9 types are like 9 portals. You recognize your particular addictive tendencies or compulsions or habits, right? Like I don't want to go to an extreme and call everything addiction, you know, but addictive tendencies. And then through that, understand like, oh, your type is looking for something in the world that you can find within yourself, right? And so yeah, type as like that portal into presence and wholeness and all the good things. Yeah. So
Very cool that you use the word portal, because I sort of later when we talk about type and sexuality, I like to use the word doorway, same idea, that sort of transcending our egoic patterns can be the way that we access divinity, and that sexuality is one way to do that. But not to get ahead of myself, I also want to ask you, you started talking about your own journey. How do sexuality and spirituality relate for you just generally?
yeah, for me, both in my personal life and in my work, instead of now looking at a relationship, I mean, like to feed, as something to feed my ego, right? Like to meet my egoic needs. There's something about relationship, intimacy, sexuality, even as being like the entry point, you know, to see that like what it brings up in me, right, especially the triggers, is a place for healing at like a deeper level if I'm willing to let it be, right? That if I'm willing to like bear through it and not try to get what I think I want or need, you know, in this moment from this person, like they're a dispenser like of like what I think I need. And so moving beyond that into something that can feel like more intimate. And then the paradox of that is that as a result, I mean, you can imagine if I'm not seeing people as things to meet my needs, that my relationship to them becomes more holy. There's something about where we're connecting more like essence to essence, something behind that persona, right? So it actually beautifies all of my relationships and interactions, and as well as supports me in reclaiming my own power to be filled up from the inside out. Like, yeah.
Relationship as a spiritual practice.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about something you mentioned offline with the original blessing and how that relates to sexuality and the shame that many people feel from religion and spirituality around sexuality, and how, you know, the unity perspective is different?
Yeah. Great question. So actually, even though I grew up kind of non-religiously, culturally, you know, there was a very fundamental Christian like culture in my city that I was brought up in. And so I remember like when I had sex for the first time, I thought I was doomed to hell, you know? And I think that's like the addictive aspect, like it spirals from there because I'm like, I'm lost anyway. I'm gone. Like I had sex before marriage. I'm done. Like, you know, and I think that coupled with already like a strong sense of insecurity and not enoughness was like, okay, well, all I can do is like fill this hole inside of me. Right. Like, you know, and so that was based on this fundamental belief that I'm broken. And so the salve of coming into the Enneagram from a whole person perspective, from this holistic perspective, and from the spiritual perspective that says you're actually born in original blessing, is this idea that we are born fundamentally whole. That actually the brokenness is the more illusory part of us and in the surface part of us. And so the restoration begins from the inside out of like reclaiming that. And for me, there was a lot of need for solitude, you know, and it was funny because I remember thinking how old school it was, this idea of like celibacy, you know, from this old, you know, like in the dogmatic old way, it feels like that, but as an intentional practice, like I remember the first time I did an intentional like 6 months of that to help me reclaim myself, the self that existed outside of relationship. That has been so vital to my life to have that. And I practice like solitary retreats often for that very reason, because of my particular type's orientation, away from self-affirmation toward other-oriented affirmation. And so, you know, every type has a different version of the way that we seek outside. But yeah, so original blessing is really about, can you trust that these hidden parts of ourselves are actually good fundamentally, right? Even if our egoic structure or Enneagram type is like, no, like for a 5, like incompetence, no, like, you know, like this not knowing something, no, you know, like, you know, and so giving permission for wholeness to be there, even if that's not the case, right? Like, yeah. So.
Okay, that's so helpful of a perspective. And I want to go from there to talking about, well, agreeing with what you said, a huge proportion of people in the West, American culture, are traumatized by like the Christian puritanical values, even if they were not raised in the church, just because our culture is influenced by that. But I want to present a different perspective, more similar to what you're saying, which is that actually many wisdom traditions support the idea of sexuality as a divine pathway. Mm-hmm. We have, you know, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, all supporting the idea of sacred sexual practices. And that's something a lot of us raised in the West are not so familiar with. But in fact, even the mystical aspects of many religions, including Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the mystical aspects also support the idea of sacred sexuality. So we end up with this dichotomy between the everyday religions in some cases, with the whole like dangers of the flesh, temptation, you know, all the things we're familiar with, when actually their very own mystical traditions associated with the same religions support that sexuality is a doorway to the divine. So I think that's really interesting, and a good segue into us talking about the Enneagram more in terms of sexuality and spirituality. Yeah. So I'll say a little bit about this, and then we can just chat about it. So one way that I like to look at this is the idea of ecstatic sexual potential or transcendent sexual potential for each type. You know, what is an ecstatic state? What is a transcendent state? That's beyond our ego, beyond our type, beyond our everyday narrative or waking consciousness or our ideas about ourselves. So there are many ways to transcend the self, including, you know, dream states, things that people have all the time. But when we intentionally cultivate this through meditation and through intentional sexual practices, etc., it can be longer sustained moments of transcendence. So this can, you know, these states can be very transformative. And the way I look at it, each Enneagram type or story has their own barrier to using or engaging with sexuality as a doorway to divinity, right? So I'm going to just give an example, maybe 2 examples, because we don't have that much time, and we can chat about each. So I randomly decided to talk about type 2, if there's any 2s here. So each type has their sexuality pitfalls, which is what they're doing within their ego. So a 2, they're probably using, what did you say, the dispenser? The other person as the dispenser. I love that. The dispenser of reassurance. The dispenser of make me feel loved, you know, when it comes to sexuality. They're also hyper focused on supporting, nurturing the partner's sexual needs, sexually selfless, you know, but resentful oftentimes. They're wanting these like emotional sexual cues. They're responding to those, but this is all within the ego of the two, right? And this is just one example. So when we look at how the two's pathway to engaging with sexuality as divinity, you can start from something that twos are very good at, which is understanding that their own energy is beneficial when given away to others. That's, you know, a righteous belief, but they tend to overdo it, right? So their barrier to achieving ecstatic sexual potential is like this intentional abdication of the self. I have no sexual needs. I'm just here to get love. I'm just here to give to you and then get love from you. You know, that's all within the ego, right? So that's the barrier. And then, like, to engage with sexuality as a spiritual practice for twos, it can look, well, I have a few examples. It can look lots of ways, but one is explore your own pleasure, you know, what actually feels good to your body. And especially powerful if you can do this with partner as a witness, either through self-pleasure or they're, you know, helping you, but you're not giving to them. Like, you're not allowed to give to them, essentially. Provide in the moment feedback about, you know, you can have your partner say, does this feel good? Does this feel good? So the twos tend not to ever do this in their sexual lives. And when I suggest this, it brings up a lot of fear in twos. Like any practice where we face ourselves, you know, twos are like, I feel, you know, I'm having a panic attack just thinking about doing that, right? Slow down and focus on receiving, you know. In classic tantra would be let the sexual energy build slowly, and assuming you have a supportive partner, which probably, hopefully you do, have them support this, you know, your pleasure pleasures me. Have them, you know, giving you messages like that, because you're probably giving them messages like that all the time, right? So these types of, it doesn't sound like a spiritual practice on its face, but when a two engages in this, because it's so opposite to what they normally would do, it can bring up so much that they sort of can go into these spiritual places. And then finally, for twos, because I'm talking too long here, a meditative practice where they imagine like waves of pleasure spreading from their body, you know, from like rays of sunshine, from their pelvis, from their whole sexual energy. It's like spreading like sunshine, benefiting the world. That would be the meditative energy to spend time in intimate spaces meditating on. And then the comment says, "This is wild. My desires. What does that even mean?" So you definitely have to start slow with this. But twos, it's this spiritual idea that your pleasure is a blessing to others. And that was a little bit long, and that's why I'm only doing one or two types here, but that's the example of what it can look like. Within your type, there's these spiritual sexual practices you can do to kind of overcome some of your egoic story and get to this transcendent place. So, Nhien, what are your thoughts and feelings on this?
Oh my God. First of all, when you talked about ecstatic, like union, like my whole body lit up. And as my body lit up, well, first I want to say, hi, electric lady. When my body lit up, I was like, this is why we don't talk about it. Like, it feels so dangerous. Like, there's something about like, oh, what you say just like impact me, you know? And we saw that comment, presumably from a type 2 earlier, around like how wild this is. Like, I want to say that, like, as you were talking about like the invitation for the type 2, I was like, yes, this is like scarily like my spiritual like invitations for the type 2, because what you described would do is break open the pride into the virtue of the two, which is humility, you know, which is like this, oh crap, like I'm not, like it's the two kind of things, like I'm the dispenser of like the world's needs. I don't need anything really, right? And so it's all like secret needs, you know, like, and so this like breaks that open. And so it dissolves the ego in that sense, right? The sense of surrender and submission to receiving. And I would add to that, that like, you've got to be prepared for what lies under the surface of when you break open the ego structure, especially in the heart types. I mean, for everyone, of course, and related to sexuality, there's shame. But we're talking about like, if a two acknowledges needs, shame is bound to arise. So don't assume that if that happens for you, that there's anything bad, right? And so that piece around recognizing that that's a necessary part of the healing, because the shame, it didn't create shame. The shame was underneath there and being protected by the fact that I have no needs. And so when you're accepting any gift that comes up, so if you know this with your partner, this is why the Enneagram is so helpful, then you can support one another in being held within that space of shame. So, oh, I missed the comment. Like, but I heard
it's okay. I saw them. There was one about, from Electric Lady, we learn so much from what feels dangerous when, you know, to us when we hear it, which is such a good point.
Yeah.
And then another comment for our two, and I'm so sorry to be picking on you, hon. But my life revolves around feeling responsibility for those around me almost all the time. So that transfers to the bedroom as well, of course. And I want to say to that, the reason that sexuality as a spiritual practice can be so powerful is because we are vulnerable in the bedroom, even if we're enacting our egos. We're sort of broken open more than in our regular walking around life. So it can be a great place to begin doing these practices for two around receiving, whereas it might be a little trickier to start doing that in other areas of your life. But Nhien, to your point, you absolutely have to have a safe container for this. You need to, you know, if you don't have a safe partner, you don't want to try to do this. If you have a safe partner, you have resources to support you in what comes up, you know, then I think you can move forward with it.
Right. If you're only operating off the egoic structures in relationship, then when a type 2 tries to receive his needs, oftentimes the family is like, well, we're used to you taking care of our needs, right? And so that vital piece around like, oh, it's just an ideal situation when both of you know the Enneagram and know what is courageous for each of you is different. And that in that space, it is exactly like the opening up of the old barrier of your egoic structure is the parallel experience of opening up to a power greater than yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
I'm so glad you're here. This is so fun. So we're actually almost at the end already. I'll try to do another one more, but it's going to be extra quick. So I was just going to talk about 7s because it's very different than 2s. And that's another great comment from Electric Lady about how women and femmes are rewarded, you know, for type 2 energy. So then people, if you stop doing it, you know, there can be resistance. Okay, so quickly on 7. So in the ego, 7s and their sexuality, you know, lots of novelty, adventurousness, bit intimacy avoidant, you know, lots of fun sex, but not so much with the intimacy, the depth. You know, high sexual desire, they report, and they can be a little bit more self-focused in terms of pleasure. So when we get into the spirituality for 7s, like 7s are always exuberant, you know, manifesting things, visioning things in bloom, like as if it's like a perpetual spring, like they're a perpetual springtime, always in bloom, right? So their barrier to achieving ecstatic sex has to do with this distraction and avoidance. When it comes to these sexual practices, it's more about embracing like an autumnal or like a winter season within your sexual life. So that involves both in your, if you're in a long-term relationship, we can get into ruts and routines that can feel like a fall or a winter to a 7. But even within one experience, we usually have like the rise and then the fall. Like afterwards, 7s are jumping out of bed right away. So the spiritual practice for 7s is stay when you want to leave. when, you know, intimacy is sort of quote over to you, it's actually not over. There's this beautiful opportunity to engage with the decay aspect of the experience. So be with the entirety of lovemaking or the entirety of intimacy, and embrace the afterward is what, you know, the simple practice is. I'm going to cut it short because we're all the way at the end already, but Nhien, you're going to take 1 minute on sevens.
Okay, closing comments. Okay, for the 7, as you were talking about this, it struck me how often when I'm doing spiritual counseling, advising the 7 on the willingness to face the desert experience, the barrenness of, like, do not populate your mind, right, with future thoughts or imaginings, and that somehow entering into the barrenness that feels empty. But if you stay like that, there's a richness, right? It's almost like if I'm riding on a bike, like I'm going to see less than if I'm walking slowly, right? If I'm speeding through, versus if I stay with what look just dull, but like I see detail at a certain level. And there's almost like this thing in the spiritual evolution of a 7 that's like, oh, if I stay with what feels barren, there was something deeper and richer in like the soil of life that I can experience that wasn't available to me when I was caught up in the egoic structure. So I love that counsel, even within sexuality, how that plays out, because the 7's like, what? It's not what's now, right? It's what's next, always. Next, not now. And like, especially if the now is like just sitting here with my partner, you know, and and it's not filled with excitement, right? And so, yeah, what a profound spiritual practice for the 7. So.
It's quite surprising that when 7s do stay with the, you know, the letdown is maybe what they would call it, the afterward, there's often a huge release of emotion. 7s will cry, like grief, it just pours from them. And it's like, it shocks them, right? So this can really open their hearts. Oh, Nhien, I want to talk forever to you. So we have to wrap up already. This was so much fun, and I hope we can do it again. So just let people know where to find you and your work.
Oh, yeah. Oh, evolvingenneagram.com. I'm here on Instagram as well, of course, here at Evolving Enneagram. So great to be with you. And yeah, happy sexy First Fridays.
And then I have a workshop on this, ecstatic sexual potential. You can find that on my website at enneagramsexpert.com, or just message us on here if you have any questions. Sorry, we're just getting juicy, and we have to stop for now. But thanks everybody for joining. Happy Sexy Friday. Thanks, Nhien, for being here.
Thanks for all your great comments in there too as well. Bye.